She lay beneath the car, frozen and motionless, when footsteps broke the silence. "Are you all alone, poor thing?" a gentle voice called out. A woman with a flashlight extended her hand. "I'll help you." And everything changed. The wind was icy. It lashed at the ground, piercing everything in its path and sparing not even the most fragile. A small gray and white cat, cloaked only in a thin, dirty layer of fur, stood on the side of the road. Her paws, reddened from the cold, barely held her frail body upright, and every movement felt like a burn. The cold wasn't just around her. It had settled inside her, devouring her from within. Snow fell relentlessly, covering the world in a thick white blanket. But for her, it wasn't a beautiful winter wonderland. It was an enemy trying to bury her alive. She took a step forward but barely managed to stay upright, stumbling on the icy asphalt. Her paws slid, leaving tiny tracks behind that were quickly swallowed by the falling snow. The blinding white light of street lamps reflected in her eyes, filled with despair and fear. She stared into the void, desperately searching for anything: a warm shelter, food, salvation. But all she saw was the merciless snowfall and the dark silhouettes of abandoned houses in the distance. Her past had been so different. Once, she had lain on a soft blanket by the fireplace, basking in the warmth of the flames and the gentle hands of a little girl who whispered to her, "You're my best friend, Snowflake." That name had been her lucky charm, but now, standing in the middle of a snowy road, she felt nameless, lost, forgotten. 2 weeks ago, her world had collapsed. A nighttime fire consumed everything: the house, the toys, the girl's smile. Her owner had cried as firefighters carried her out of the burning house, but Snowflake had been left outside. She had waited for hours, days, nights, but the people never returned. She called for them with thin, plaintive meows that were drowned out by the noise of cars and barking dogs. No one heard her. No one came. Now she lived in a cold emptiness, and each new day brought only pain and suffering. Hunger had become a constant companion. Her stomach tightened with emptiness, forcing her to rummage through garbage bins. But even there, she found only frozen, empty wrappers. The wind grew stronger, as if trying to knock her off her feet. She crouched down, pressing herself against the ground, instinctively curling into a tiny ball in the hope of preserving some warmth. But the ground was as cold as the air around her. Her fur offered no protection. Instead, it only amplified the chill, soaked through and stiff. The cat raised her head. In the distance there was a rumble, the sound of a car pushing through the snow. She held her breath, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes. Perhaps this was someone who would save her. But the car sped past without slowing. Its headlights briefly illuminated her trembling, exhausted figure before vanishing into the snowstorm. She lowered her head slowly, closing her eyes. Warm memories of the house and the girl were replaced by the harsh reality of the cold. Her heart pounded in her chest, as if reminding her she was still alive. But why? That question echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. Once, she had been strong and independent. She had proudly walked through the house, hunted shadows, and basked in the praise of the girl who adored her. But now, all of that felt so far away, like someone else's life. The lonely sound of the wind howling became her only companion. She lifted a paw to wipe the snow from her face, but her movements were slow and unsteady. She could feel her strength slipping away. The cold seeped deeper, freezing not just her body but her spirit as well. Everything around her was silent, as though the world itself had frozen, waiting for her end. The cat looked around one last time, hoping to find even the smallest sign of warmth, but all her gaze met was emptiness. Her world had become a frozen prison from which there seemed to be no escape. She took another step, then another, but suddenly her paws gave out. She collapsed into the snow, feeling its icy roughness. She didn't move. Only her eyes, filled with pain and longing, stared into the distance. Her tiny figure was nearly swallowed by the white silence of the night. Snowflake closed her eyes, trying to shut out the pain and fear. Her breathing slowed, becoming almost imperceptible, and somewhere deep in her heart, a faint spark of hope still lingered. She prayed for rescue, even though she no longer believed it would come. Night fell on the city like a heavy black blanket. The snow no longer swirled playfully as it does in children's fairy tales. Instead, it poured mercilessly from the sky, filling every crack, every corner. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It had become a sinister living entity, hunting the weakest as if it were alive. Snowflake trudged along an abandoned street, sinking into the snow that reached up to her emaciated sides. Every step was a struggle. Her frost-bitten paws had grown numb, as if her body no longer belonged to her. She moved mechanically, as though the faint beat of her heart was forcing her forward, despite the pain, despite the cries of every second urging her to stop. The silence around her was terrifying. The city slept, shielded from the relentless cold within the warmth of its homes. Only lonely windows, dimly lit, stared down at her like silent witnesses to her suffering. Snowflake lifted her gaze to one of those windows. Inside she could see shadows, silhouettes of people laughing, moving around a table. There was warmth in there. There was a world she had lost. Her heart clenched with pain. She knew she couldn't go there. People feared creatures like her, dirty, stray, unwanted. She remembered the time she was chased off a doorstep, a boot thrown at her. That day, she realized she no longer belonged. Snowflake approached an old car she had sheltered under the previous night. It felt like the only place even remotely safe. The metal was as cold as everything else around her, but at least it shielded her from the wind. She crawled underneath the car with difficulty, curling up tightly, trying to find warmth within her own body. But her breath could barely warm her anymore. Everything around her was frozen in stillness. Only the howl of the wind broke the eerie silence. At that moment, she felt as though the world had turned its back on her. Each time she closed her eyes, it felt like it might be the last. She could no longer feel her paws or her tail, just the piercing cold that had consumed her entirely. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and there was no stopping the shivering. Snowflake could feel her strength fading, as if life itself was slipping away from her drop by drop. She closed her eyes, and an image of the little girl flashed before her. Tiny hands holding her, a soft voice calling her Snowflake. She saw that room with the blanket and the fireplace. For a brief moment, it felt like she was home again, safe and warm. But reality tore her back. A loud noise startled her. It was the bark of a dog, sharp and threatening. Terrified, Snowflake froze. The dog barked somewhere nearby, its voice echoing through the darkness. Her heart raced. She knew she couldn't run. Her paws wouldn't carry her anymore. The dog eventually moved on, but the fear lingered. She curled herself tighter, burying her face in her paws. Her eyes filled with tears that froze before they could fall. She wanted to sleep, but she knew she couldn't. Sleep was the same as death. That night, everything seemed hopeless. She thought that perhaps this was the end, that she wouldn't survive another day. The frosty air burned her lungs, and every second reminded her how fragile her life was. The sky above was black, starless, as if even it had abandoned her. And yet, deep inside her, Snowflake clung to something. She didn't know why, but there was still a tiny spark. She held on to that feeling, as though it was the last branch preventing her from falling into the abyss. She looked down the road. No one. Only snow and darkness. The world had become empty, cold, indifferent. But somewhere in her heart, a faint, almost imperceptible voice whispered, "Keep going. Just keep going." And in that unrelenting night, beneath the endless snowfall, she lay, trembling from the cold and fear. The night ruled mercilessly, but Snowflake was still breathing. Her breaths were shallow, but they were proof that she hadn't given up. Not yet. Snowflake had no idea how much time had passed. The night had turned into an endless tunnel of cold and pain, where every breath was a small victory. Her body had gone so numb that she could barely feel her paws. Snow continued to fall mercilessly, burying her fragile figure under a white blanket. Her breathing grew weak, as if nature itself was trying to extinguish the final spark of her life. But in this frozen hell, a sound broke through. Quiet, soft, yet jarring against the dead silence of the night. Footsteps. Someone was walking through the snow, their rhythmic steps disrupting the monotonous howl of the wind. Snowflake held her breath, unsure of what awaited her, salvation or a new threat. She lifted her head, her gaze cloudy and weak. From a distance, she made out a silhouette, a figure wrapped in a long coat, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. A woman. She moved slowly, carefully scanning the road ahead, her steps cautious, as though she was searching for something. Snowflake pressed herself against the ground, her tiny body tensing. Her heart pounded in her chest. Fear and survival instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. Her paws refused to obey, and her strength was completely gone. All she could do was lie there, waiting for fate to decide her end. The woman stopped. Her flashlight's beam illuminated the snow beneath the car, and the light, like a ray of hope, fell on the small, trembling creature. Snowflake froze. She met the woman's gaze, warm eyes filled with compassion, standing in stark contrast to the harsh winter night. "Oh my goodness. Are you all alone out here?" The woman whispered, her voice soft, like a warm breeze cutting through the icy storm. Snowflake stared at her, unmoving. Her instincts screamed, "Don't trust her! People only bring pain!" But there was no hint of threat in the woman's eyes. Slowly she knelt down, extending her hand. "Don't be afraid, little one. I won't hurt you." Snowflake turned her head away, her gaze darting between the woman and the snow beneath her paws. She was on the edge, every muscle in her body ready to flee, but she couldn't. The woman did something no one had done before. She didn't rush. She simply sat there in the snow, her hand extended, waiting. Then the woman pulled something small from her pocket, a packet of food. She opened it, releasing a scent that ignited a deep hunger in Snowflake's frail body. The cat took a tiny step forward, then hesitated. "You're hungry, aren't you?" the woman said, breaking off a piece of food and gently placing it on the snow. Snowflake trembled, torn by an unbearable inner conflict. The desire to eat warred with her fear. She took another step forward, then another. Her nose twitched, taking in the scent she hadn't smelled in so long. She lowered her head to the food and ate it, still ready to dart away at any moment. The woman didn't move. Her breathing was soft, and her eyes were watchful, but not frightening. "That's it, good girl. Just a little more, okay?" the woman said, laying down another small portion. Snowflake ate again. She could feel something warm creeping into her soul, not just from the food, but from the fact that someone cared. The woman reached her hand closer. Her fingers slowly approached the cat's fur. Snowflake flinched, but the woman didn't rush. "It's okay. It's going to be okay," she whispered as her fingers gently brushed against Snowflake's coat. The warmth of her hand seeped into Snowflake's body, stirring forgotten feelings within her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt a human touch that carried kindness. The woman carefully picked her up, wrapping her in a scarf. Snowflake struggled at first, her tiny paws clawing at the air. But the warmth of the woman, her soft voice, and her strong yet gentle arms reassured her. She relented. The woman held her close to her chest, shielding her from the wind and cold. Snowflake felt her body slowly relax. She buried her nose into the scarf, searching for the warmth and comfort she hadn't known in so long. The woman began to walk, leaving footprints in the deep snow. She whispered words of comfort, promising that everything would be different now. Snowflake didn't understand the words, but there was something in them that warmed her frozen heart. For the first time in weeks, a light appeared in her soul. It was a tiny flame, flickering gently, telling her that maybe, just maybe, she could still be saved. Snowflake lay wrapped in a soft old blanket that smelled of warmth and something sweet, like milk. She opened her eyes slowly, as if not fully believing this wasn't a dream. The flickering flames of the fireplace cast a gentle glow across the room, their light dancing on the wooden floor. She could hear the wind still howling outside the window, but it could no longer reach her. The woman, her rescuer, sat nearby, holding a cup of hot tea. She watched Snowflake carefully, as though any sudden movement might startle her. "You're home now," the woman said softly, and the words hung in the air like magic. But what was home? To Snowflake, the word had lost its meaning. Home had been where she was loved, where the warm hands of a little girl stroked her head, where a soft blanket covered her as she slept. That home had disappeared in the fire, taking a piece of her soul with it. Now she wasn't sure if she could ever feel safe again. Cautiously, she rose to her feet, her weak paws still trembling. Her fur, though dry, was tangled and coarse, but for the first time in weeks, she felt warmth. Not the searing cold or the burning fear, but a gentle heat that warmed her from within. She took a few tentative steps, her small body still alert, ready to flee at the slightest threat. The woman noticed her movement and smiled. "You're hungry, aren't you?" she said as she stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Snowflake followed her with her eyes, but didn't move. Trust was still a distant notion. Moments later, the woman returned with a bowl filled with warm milk and small pieces of cooked fish. The smell was so rich that Snowflake's stomach clenched in hunger. The woman placed the bowl gently on the floor and stepped back, giving Snowflake space. The cat slowly approached, her eyes still watchful, tracking every movement. She lowered her head to the bowl and began to eat. The warm liquid filled her with a soothing heat, and the taste of the fish reminded her of distant days when her life had been whole and happy. After finishing her meal, Snowflake cautiously approached the fireplace. Its warmth embraced her like gentle arms. She curled up on an old rug near the hearth, closing her eyes. For a moment, all her worries melted away. But sleep did not bring peace. Her memories, like an old film reel, began to replay the horrors she had endured. She saw the fire consuming her home. She heard the little girl calling her, but her voice grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely. She felt the cold, the hunger, the fear all over again. She woke abruptly, letting out a soft, distressed meow. Her eyes were wide open, and her heart pounded as if she were running through the snow once more. The woman was there. She had knelt beside her, not trying to touch her, but simply being present. Her voice was soft and soothing. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, little one. You're safe now." Snowflake stared at her for a long moment. In the woman's eyes, there was kindness, a kind she had stopped expecting from people. She took a small step forward, then another. Her paws lightly touched the woman's knees before she allowed herself to nuzzle against her hand. It felt like breaking through ice, like the first ray of sunlight after a long winter. The woman gently stroked her head, her fingers warm and tender. Snowflake didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, feeling something deep inside her begin to heal. Days passed. Each morning, Snowflake woke feeling a little more confident. She explored the house, taking small, tentative steps to claim this new space as her own. There were cozy corners, soft cushions, and a woman who spoke to her every day as though she were the most important creature in the world. But the scars in her heart remained. Loud noises or sudden drafts would still send her running to hide under the table or in a quiet corner. The memories of her struggles lingered, like shadows that refused to fade. Yet the woman never rushed her. She simply sat nearby, humming softly or telling stories, allowing Snowflake to emerge in her own time. One evening, Snowflake climbed onto the couch where the woman was sitting. She curled up in her lap, trusting her completely for the first time. The woman wrapped her arms around the small cat, holding her close. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside the window. Snowflake knew her past would always stay with her. It was a part of her, like the scars on her heart. But now she had a home, a real home, a place where there was warmth, love, and someone who saw her not as a stray, but as a soul deserving of happiness. That night she fell asleep peacefully. For the first time in a long while, her dreams were not filled with nightmares, but with warmth and silence.